Hey everyone. You know how we're always looking for ways to speed up those data factory pipelines in Fabric? Well, today we're tackling a sneaky little detail that can really trip you up, the set variable activity. It seems like it should be helpful, but sometimes it can actually slow things down, especially when we're dealing with parallel processing.
That's right.
We've got a fantastic article here by Shrest Shukla called How to Design Data Factory Pipeline for Parallel Processing in Fabric. It's going to help us break this all down.
Yeah, it's a great resource for anyone working with Fabric.
Okay, so let's dive in. What's the main problem with using set variable when we're trying to achieve parallel processing?
The key is understanding how variables actually work within the pipeline.
Okay.
In Fabric Data Factory, variables operate at the pipeline level.
At the pipeline level.
Yeah, not at the activity level.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
Think of it this way.
Yeah.
The entire pipeline is like a big factory floor, and variables are like shared tools that everyone on that floor uses.
Hmm.
If one person changes a tool while others are using it, it can cause problems, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's the same with variables. If one part of your pipeline changes a variable while another part is trying to use it, things can get messy.
So if we're processing multiple files in a loop, let's say, and we're using set variable to keep track of the current file name,
Right.
we're essentially changing that tool with each iteration.
Exactly. And that can disrupt other processes that are running at the same time.
So even though we think we've set everything up for parallel processing,
Right.
we might actually be forcing everything to run sequentially.
It's a common mistake,
Uh-huh.
and it can be really frustrating when you're trying to optimize for speed.
It definitely sounds like a headache waiting to happen. So how do we get around this problem? Shukla mentioned something about invoking a separate pipeline. What's that all about?
It's a pretty clever solution. Instead of trying to handle everything within a single loop, you create a dedicated pipeline, specifically for the task you want to run in parallel. Then, within your main loop, each item, like a file, triggers a new instance of that separate pipeline.
So visually, it's like branching out. Instead of trying to cram everything into one lane, each file gets its own dedicated track.
Exactly. And Fabric has this great tool for this, the invoke pipeline activity. You can even pass information, like file names, as parameters to these separate pipelines, so each instance knows what to work on.
That sounds very promising. We're finally breaking free from that sequential bottleneck and achieving true parallel processing. But I have a feeling there might be a catch.
There's almost always a catch, isn't there? As with any solution, there are situations where this approach might not be ideal. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Shukla gives a good example in the article. Imagine you're working with notebooks that need to grab the maximum ID from a table, before inserting any new data.
Okay, so we're adding new records to a table, but we need to figure out what the next ID should be first.
Right, exactly. Now, if you're running these notebooks in parallel and you're using that separate pipeline method we talked about, you could run into a problem.
I have a feeling I know where this is going. Multiple processes, all trying to grab that same maximum ID at the same time.
You got it. They could all end up with the same ID, thinking it's the most up-to-date one. Then what happens? They all try to insert new data using that same ID.
Oh, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Data corruption, conflicts, the whole nine yards. Not exactly the parallel processing we were hoping for.
Definitely not. So it seems like this separate pipeline approach, while useful, isn't a cure-all. There are still some things we need to consider.
It sounds like we need to think carefully about how our data is going to behave when multiple processes are accessing it at the same time.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just throw parallel processing at the problem. We need to understand the specifics of what we're doing and what could go wrong.
So if we're dealing with something like getting those max IDs or any other operation that could cause problems when run in parallel, what are our options?
Well, there are different techniques you can use, and it often comes down to a trade-off between complexity and performance. You could, for instance, use locking mechanisms.
Locking mechanisms.
Yeah, so only one process can access that critical resource, like the maximum ID, at a time.
So it's like putting a temporary out of order sign on that shared tool in our factory analogy.
Exactly. Or you could look into alternative approaches, like using unique identifiers that don't clash even when things are running concurrently.
That sounds like it might involve a bit of creative problem solving. So after this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you'd like our listener to remember?
The biggest takeaway is understanding that the scope of variables in Fabric Data Factory can really make or break your parallel processing efforts. That set variable activity can easily become a bottleneck.
It's kind of sneaky like that. But at least now we know how to spot the danger and use those separate pipelines to get real parallelism in many cases.
Right. It's a powerful tool, but we need to remember that it's not a universal solution. We always need to consider the specific actions we're performing and whether those concurrent processes could lead to trouble.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with a question to think about. Knowing these potential issues with set variable in loops and the power of those separate pipelines, what other situations can you think of where this knowledge would be crucial in your data pipelines?
That's a great question to ponder. It really encourages you to think about the broader implications of what we've discussed today.
Data processing is full of these subtle but important considerations. As you become more experienced with Fabric, learning to identify these potential bottlenecks early on will save you a lot of frustration down the line.
I completely agree. A little bit of foresight in data engineering can go a long way.
That's a really good point. It's not just about knowing the solutions. We need to know when to use them and what the potential downsides might be.
Exactly. And the more you work with these ideas, the better you'll get at spotting those situations and coming up with creative ways to deal with them.
So can you give us a few more examples? What other scenarios might come up where this knowledge about variable scope and parallel processing would be really useful, just to give our listeners some ideas?
Okay, well, imagine you've got a pipeline that's processing data from a bunch of different sources,
Mm-hmm.
like different databases, APIs, things like that.
Yeah, pretty common scenario.
And you're using set variable to keep track of all the connection strings and other configuration details.
Okay.
Well, you could run into that same issue we talked about earlier.
Uh-oh.
Those parallel processes might step on each other's toes, causing errors or slowing things down.
So we could use that separate pipeline method again.
Exactly. Give each source its own dedicated pipeline. That way you avoid the risk of those variable conflicts.
That makes sense. What about, let's say we're doing some complex calculations or transformations in our pipeline,
Okay.
and we're using variables to hold some of the in-between results.
Right. Do we need to be careful about parallel processing there too?
Absolutely. You've got to think about how those parallel processes might affect those values.
So separate pipelines could help there as well?
They could. That way, you can make sure those calculations are isolated and the results are correct.
It seems like the big lesson here is that understanding how variable scope affects parallel processing is just crucial.
I think so.
It's essential for building data pipelines in Fabric that are efficient and that we can rely on.
It really is. It's one of those core concepts that can make a huge difference in your work as a data engineer.
Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today.
I hope so.
I hope they're feeling ready to tackle those set variable challenges and build some really awesome pipelines that run without a hitch.
That's the goal. And if anyone's ever struggling with a pipeline that's just not working right, they can always come back to this discussion. And of course, check out that article by Shresh Shukla. It's a great resource. Great advice. And remember, data engineering is all about continuous learning. Even those little details can have a big impact. So keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep those pipelines flowing.
Well said. It's been great diving deep into this topic with you today.
Likewise. And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into parallel processing in Microsoft Fabric. We'll see you next time.